So, once again, as always, I'm a tournament analyst. Take everything that I say through the scope of a tournament lens. Unless I specifically mention that I'm talking about ladder, I'm not talking about ladder. And because of that, we're going to skip through this cool little metagame snapshot that Riot has provided. If you are interested in ladder, which you probably should be, then go ahead and take a look at this. But I'm going to skip over it because it's not tournament data. So, I mean, obviously they're going to grab things from ladder, but I always want to talk about how things are going to specifically affect the tournament landscape. In patch 1.14, we do have a lot of buffs, which we haven't seen in about 10 patches because it was patch 1.4 where we got, or maybe it was 1.6. We got a bunch of buffs, Darrowing came into existence, Bald Eagle. There were a lot of really cool decks that came out of it. There are 16 changes this patch, and 7 of them are to champions, 8 of them if you count Black Spear, because it also affects Kallista's Black Spear, because it was a buff, maybe that'll help out the Kallista archetype a little bit more. So, we're just going to jump right into it and get started with all of these massive changes and how I think they could affect the tournament landscape. So there's 2 different tournament formats. I'm going to try to speak on both of them a little bit. I might forget every now and then, but we've got region locked best of 3, 1 ban conquest, and then we've got the Riot format, which is pseudo region locked, no overlapping combinations, no overlapping champions, 3 deck, 1 ban. That is not only the format that we will be playing the seasonal tournament in, but this is the meta that we will be playing the seasonal tournament in. Earlier in the patch, they had mentioned that this will be the last balance change going into the seasonal tournaments, and then basically the way that the timeline is going to work out is that we get this patch next, 2 weeks from now, the patch is going to be one of the minor patches, sort of background things, probably some updates to spectator mode in terms of quality of life, maybe some bug fixes. If there's any egregious outlying deck that came out of this patch, they'll probably have to nerf it a little bit, but they had mentioned up above that their parameters are a 55% win rate and a 15% play rate. I don't think anything is going to hit there in this patch, but I'll get into that later on what I think sort of the best change in this patch was. But the timeline that we're looking at is about a month from now, we're going to have our seasonal tournament. Very shortly after that, because it's not going to be a balance patch, it should be the patch where we get the next, the last part of Call of the Mountain, the 3rd expansion where we get Piltover and Zon, Noxus, and a few more Targon cards. And then, it'll reset, we'll go into another seasonal tournament, a month in, we'll get another really big balance patch, and I think that's kind of how they're looking to do things for now. So, very excited for all that, but let's focus on what's in front of us, starting with this balance patch, patch 1.14. So the Lucian and Jinx changes are actually really cool because they bring these champions in line with what we've seen out of a lot of other champions. Sejuani is able to level herself and activate her ability in the same turn that she leveled, so it's really cool to see everything brought in line. Consistency across all cards is great. Now obviously it makes these champions a lot better, and Lucian wasn't in a bad spot necessarily. Scouts is one of the predominant tournament decks at the moment, and it is pretty much across the board Misfortune and Quinn. Now, a lot of top players have expressed sort of a dissatisfaction with Quinn. They don't think she's that good, but she is sort of the best option available. Lucian Misfortune is something that we had seen in the past, and if you're looking to go all out on your aggro, then yeah, Lucian Misfortune is probably an adaptation that we're going to see out of Scout players, at least experimented with, especially going into this opening weekend. So if you've got a big tournament coming out this weekend, Lucian Misfortune is probably going to be a little bit more popular than Misfortune Quinn, and the change for this is significant, especially for some of the Lucian-centric decks that we've seen in the past. We've seen Lucian Senna rally mist rates before, and having Glimpse Beyond available or something to kill one of your own units in combination, like, the Lucian levels because your Senna died, and then you go ahead and Glimpse Beyond something else, immediately get that battle step. This is an insanely big change for Lucian. And it should push him into the meta in the Scout decks at the very least. I don't know that Demacia Mist Wraiths is sort of the most effective way to play Mist Wraiths. It was always kind of a really off-meta deck, but, the rally effects might be a little bit better than Go Get It, which is sort of the version of Mist Wraiths that we're seeing currently. I'm not sure about that one. I'm going to focus more on the Scouts, but I do think this is going to be something that you're going to see come out, especially as we saw some nerfs to Freljord. It's going to reduce the playability of Avalanche if you're not playing as much Freljord ramp, because generally you only play that in ramp-style decks. Of course, Ranger's Resolve is back to being a 3 of, or at least a 2 of across every Scout deck, so you do still have the option to protect Lucian Misfortune from Avalanche, which is sort of the premier way in the game to get both of them off the field in the same turn and prevent one of their level ups. But overall, insane change for Lucian. So while Scouts is taking up your Bilgewater Demacia regional combination in the Riot format, yeah, you can run Demacia Targon. Do I think it's good? No. Do I think this change for Shyvana is impactful? Yes, because when you're trying not to overlap on champions, when you're running potentially, 3 scout decks, or, I mean, we call it scouts, bannerman, whatever you want to say, the mid-range Demacia style aggressively curved decks, the Demacia tempo, we'll say. There were a couple of players that had some success in Duels of Runeterra 17 running basically the same deck 3 times. They would not repeat the regional combination, and they would not repeat champions, and we would see them run something like Misfortune Quinn, Garen Zed, and then whatever their third bannerman deck was, Vi, whatever they happen to choose. But I do think that Shyvana getting this attack buff actually does make her a pretty good, not super scuffed tempo Demacia sort of bannerman style deck. I don't think you're going to be running dragons. I do still think that that archetype is a little bit out there. I don't think a 1 power buff to Shyvana really puts that deck anywhere. But as far as just putting her in a sort of third deck in your Riot tournament lineup isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. She is a lot stronger than Quinn now. She is going to be a 5/5 when she attacks, and she only the big thing about this change is that she levels up a lot easier on blocks. So because she is a self-sustaining champion in terms of leveling up, all of a sudden now, previously you had to attack with her 3 times in order to get her to level up, and blocks didn't actually accelerate that process at all because she was dealing in 4 damage breakpoints. So she is actually going to be able to level herself up a little bit easier, and her level up is very good once you get it off. So I do think that this is actually a really big change for Shyvana, just not for dragons. I literally have an entire video on Vladimir and how I felt like the supporting cast around him is what was going to need the buff here. I mean, this is a cool change for Vladimir. It does give you a lot of different options when playing him, and it doesn't feel bad to attack with 1 HP units, which was one of the big problems that I had with Vladimir. I don't think it's going to push him into tournament viability, though, especially since we didn't see any additional nerfs to Swain, which is still sort of the king of Noxus. And I think that you still need to do something to the Crimson units or just build a better supporting cast around him, because honestly, I think Vladimir was actually fine. I think it was just the units around him that needed to be buffed up a little bit, the followers specifically. And I mean, I don't think this is actually going to push Vladimir into tournament viability whatsoever. I know that like Swain, Vladimir, Bilgewater is like a deck that people have talked about, but I don't think it's got any legs to stand on even with this change. So one thing that I do want to mention about the Vladimir before I move on to Trundle, as we do see Trundle go from 6 HP down to 5, is that with Vladimir getting his level up condition reduced to 5 units, it is a little bit easier to turbo him out. And a 5 mana 6/6 with regen is not a bad unit on its own, the ability aside. So Trundle falling down to 5 HP here is massive in a lot of ways. If you're playing something like Feel the Rush or a War Mother's Mirror, War Mother's was really the only one that was playing Hearthguard, but now Trundle not being able to block Hearthguard, it actually gives a really big tempo swing to the War Mother's player if you guys are matching each other on ramp. And with the Wording Stone nerf, I don't even know if Freljord ramp is something we're still going to see en masse. Trundle having 6 HP was integral to the play rate that he did and the power level that he sustained. And on top of that, the Ice Pillar got nerfed. Maybe if Trundle had just been nerfed and the Pillar had remained the same, he would have maintained let's say he's at a 15% play rate or something along those lines. Maybe he goes down to 12%. Here, I would expect to see him go down to less than 10. And much like Jack the Winner, it feels like Riot is just starting to figure out that you can't have 6 HP on a 5-drop that is either a follower or an unleveled champion. And I cannot count how many times I've seen that 6 HP be integral to Trundle surviving. Granted, Troll Chant does still exist in this region, Elixir of Iron as well, so maybe you just have to build some more deck building considerations around the Trundle and trying to play with this new health total, but I definitely expect a big fall off in Trundle. I expect a big fall off in War Mothers. Feel the Rush does have a little bit of a better time because it's not as locked into Shadow Isle Freljord as it felt like War Mothers was, and while Sejuani's not a great War Mother's hit, she is still a pretty good Feel the Rush hit, and I feel like unleveled Trundle was sort of the weak point of Feel the Rush when you get out this 10/10 regen and it hasn't leveled yet because you brought it out on your attack turn and it doesn't have Overwhelm. Sejuani does still fit the bill there, so maybe Feel the Rush is going to be fine. You just go Sejuani Tryndamere now, especially because Sejuani is a good anti-Feel the Rush tool as a champion to just drop down in response to a Feel the Rush, negate one of those attacks. We'll have to see how it all plays out, but I do expect Freljord ramp to take a big hit both between this and the Wording Stone nerf. Definitely down from like top of tier 1, maybe down even into like tier 2. What you have to keep in mind when looking at this new Trundle and thinking about all the strategies that he used to fit into is that he is now a worse Scar Maiden Reaver. The 5 mana 4/5 Overwhelm regen that Freljord has had this entire time, 5 HP just doesn't get it done. You need 6 HP and to be able to trade with these 5 drops in order to take advantage of your regen keyword. Surviving Genevieve Elmhart was a massive thing for Trundle, and he just doesn't have that anymore. I don't think that this is a champion that's going to make it out alive of this patch. This is pretty close to the change that I had wanted for Ezreal back when we were first talking about him getting nerfed. The one difference that I had was rather than dealing 2 damage when you target something, I had him creating 0 mana Mystic shots because I wanted the power tied into Ezreal attacking. Now with things like Sharpsight and Hush running amok in the format, that's not a realistic option. And overall, I'm not sure how good Ezreal is still going to be. There's a lot of aggro in the meta, and while Ezreal used to be like an okay tool himself at generating Mystic shots and picking off the board of a couple of aggro decks and letting himself scale into the late game, that's not really going to work now with cards, specifically Sharpsight, running around as much as they are in the scout lists and even in some, Shen Fiora decks. It's just way too risky to attack with your Ezreal, but that's the targeting 6 enemies is a really big change. He is going to not necessarily act as the finisher that he once did. Karma Ezreal not going to work out as well because you would have to play 20 burst speed spells, or rather 10 burst speed spells with a Karma and Ezreal on field, and that's just not a realistic option. There's not a lot of burst speed spells that target your opponent's units, especially in Piltover's on Ionia. There might not even be any. I'd have to actually look into it, but I'm pretty sure there are none. But overall, I think that 1 damage to Nexus does make him more of a supporter card than an actual win condition, which is kind of what we wanted. The problem is that Piltover and Zaun as a region is too weak to support a strategy like that. So this is a change that I'm kind of going to want to backburner until we see what comes out of the 3rd expansion of Call of the Mountain, what the new Piltover and Zaun cards offer up, not specifically to Ezreal, but to the archetype as a whole of Piltover and just the region in general. But PNZ's always been a very open region in tournaments, especially since the Ezreal and Heimerdinger nerfs. So you've got the option to go for something like this. It's going to be a lot easier to level up. So maybe Shadow Isle Ezreal is going to be the way, just anything that'll let you get out multiple Ezreals at a time, sort of go back to that old, I've got 2 damage on everything. We've got 4 damage when I'm targeting multiple units. So, harrowing Ezreal is something that players have played in the past. It's something Teal Red has been looking into specifically lately. So if we're going to see Ezreal pop back up, that is how I would expect it to be done, at least in the first couple iterations. Maybe we see Ezreal have a really big spike in playability early on, and then players adapt to the new strategies and start to be able to beat it up. But I don't think that this is going to be a meta mainstay in patch 1.14. Jinx feels like one of, if not the most impactful changes in the patch. While it was just brought in line with the other champions and the way that they functioned along a similar vein like Sejuani, I want to say that more than half the time, so an important distinction before I get into this, you don't get a Super Death Rocket immediately upon emptying your hand. You have to empty your hand, get some cards in hand, and re-empty it all in the same turn in order to get the Super Mega Death Rocket. That said, I feel like maybe more than half the time that you're leveling a Jinx, it's either with Rummage, Zaunite Urchin, or Augmented Experimenter. I don't think Zaunite Urchin has been seeing a whole lot of play in the discard aggro decks, but with this change, that could change. And I do think that being able to get something like that immediately off this Jinx is going to be absolutely insane for the discard aggro, especially in the instances where you are rummaging. Because now all of a sudden, if I can rummage into, super high roll, I have 2 mana left, I rummage into a Poro Cannon, I discard my other card, I get my Death Rocket, I fire it off immediately, and just accelerating that clock is really good, and discard aggro already felt like it was really well poised into what people were bringing in the meta. Yeah, it doesn't do phenomenal against Avalanche, but I do think that that's going to be getting cut a little bit more as we saw the Warding Stone nerf, because Warding Stone was unplayable at 3 mana. I think people tend to forget that, and there are some nerfs where you roll them back and the health just doesn't line up. Think of Petty Officer. It was a 3-1, it became a 3-2, it was great. Put it back at a 3-1, all of a sudden nobody's playing it anymore. It was experimented with for a while, and I expect War Mothers and other ramp decks to do the same, but overall I think that's going to fall to the wayside. And then you have to remember that if Freljord is going to stop being played as a ramp deck, then the next best option was Frostbite midrange. It's been a meta mainstay for a while, and discard aggro initially propelled itself into the tournament meta as a very good counter pick to Frostbite midrange. So I do think that this deck was already very good in the meta. I think it's going to get a lot better, and this is probably my pick for best change in the patch, or at least like most impactful, best for the deck. The Taric buff is kind of hard to say, as well as the other supporter buffs, because when we see a lot of buffs happen, generally one of the cooler things to happen is that new archetypes get created. For example, Darrowing and Bald Eagle were 2 of the big ones that came out of the previous patch where we got a lot of buffs. So I'm not going to talk too much on Taric because there's no supporter deck that already existed for Taric to sort of get propelled into. There's Taric Fiora, but it's not like something that we see maybe even 1% of the time in tournaments. It's very possible that you enter a tournament and absolutely nobody is playing that deck. So if there is some cool new Taric deck that comes out, great, but I can't speak on this one too much because there's no existing archetype that this benefits that's already seeing play. This Tiana Crown Guard changes nothing. She was taking 9 attack units to die earlier because she has tough. Now she was taking 8 attack units earlier to die, and now she has some trading power into things like Captain Farron. That doesn't matter. It doesn't impact anything. She can trade with Leviathan, but I think that Tiana Crown Guard is like a very specific combo piece, and the stats weren't what was holding her back. It was more so just the viability of the combo around her. Because for those of you that have never seen Tiana Crown Guard before, you know, generally when she sees play, it's with Callista, and you're trying to Callista to revive a Tiana and get 2 combat phases in a turn, but I don't think this changes anything in terms of her playability. The later we get into Legends of Runeterra, the more it feels like there are some things that just don't fall well within the parameters of the game. Brood Awakening would be, you know, ideally a 5.5 mana card. It's oppressive at 5, it's unplayable at 6. Braum, unplayable at 0 attack, broken at 1 attack. Wording Stone, unplayable at 3 health, broken at 4 health. I think that's just kind of the... You know, it is possible that we constantly go back and forth on this change in Wording Stone over the course of the lifespan of Legends of Runeterra, deciding that there are metas that would be well shaken up by ramp strategies being viable, and then once they become a little bit too much through some other additions, go ahead and reel them back into line. And I would expect that, you know, this isn't necessarily the last that we've seen of 4 health Wording Stone, but I do like the position getting rolled back on it. I think that it was a little bit too effective of a blocker, you know, as well as being hard to remove at that 4 health breakpoint. It just was able to block way too many things. You couldn't even kill it with a Misfortune and a Laurent Protege. You know, Fiora couldn't kill it. It was just doing a little bit too much work. And this on top of the Trundle change, we are definitely going to see the Freljord landscape change a lot, which is currently the biggest question mark for someone like me who likes to look at past tournaments and, you know, sort of decide how is this going to affect the decks that we've seen before. We're going to have to see new decks rise from the ashes of Freljord. Because the ones that already existed that played Wording Stone and Trundle, they are going to be so severely reduced in power that you're going to have to find something new. Fuzzy Caretaker is sort of along the same line as Taric. There was no deck that was running this before. I don't think these buffs change anything about the card or its playability or necessarily buff up the supporter archetype in a major way, especially because you put it down to 2 health. Every time that I've played with or against Fuzzy Caretaker, I feel like it would have been a lot better if it gave its supported ally the +0/+3, and then it itself got the attack buff if it was supported, but that's not the way the card works, and I don't think it's going to be played anymore. Mina Swiftfoot actually started to pick up play recently in a Feel the Rush Ionia deck. It was still Trundle Tryndamere. It still played a lot of the ramp. Mina was actually doing a lot of work in the deck as an anti-Feel the Rush strategy, but her ability is really meta-specific. It was very good against Lee Sin. It was very good against Feel the Rush, but I think with the ramp getting nerfed in Freljord, that was the one spot that she found herself in, and I don't think the stats are really what was holding her back. It really is just the cost. So it's cool that, you know, now if you do get her down later on, if you are still playing this Ionia Feel the Rush deck as a counter Feel the Rush strategy, if I've completely misread how viable Feel the Rush is going to be, then yeah, this Mina Swiftfoot change is really cool, but you know, maybe she is a realistic win con now, because this is a 6/5, her body was too weak. We had talked about how 6 HP is sort of the breakpoint that you need for a unit rather, to just be really good, Jack the Winner, Trundle, things like that. At 5 HP, you're just dying to 5 drops, and yeah, you probably bounced a lot of them, but there are certain 5 attack units that you don't want to bounce, like Aversion Hearthguard, which is one of the more popular ones in the format, Genevieve Elmhart. So maybe this 6 attack, or the 6 health, as well as the quick attack, is going to be enough to put her over the top, but I mean, what deck do you think you're going to be playing this in? There's really only like a small handful of Ionia decks that are seeing play right now. It's Spooky Karma, it's Lee Sin, it's Go Get It Mistwraiths. Maybe she starts to see play in Spooky Karma with a health point like this, but I don't know. I think that that would be an adaptation that is made more off of just, hey, this card got buffed, let's try it out, rather than, man, Mina Swiftfoot was a great addition to Spooky Karma, but her stats have been holding her back. Not having an ability has been holding her back. Overall, this looks like a really solid card, though, so I'm excited to try it out myself, but I don't think this is going to see any meta play in tournaments, although it is probably the one that I'm the most optimistic about. I don't want to say that Taric and the Squirrel were my most pessimistic sort of views on things that were changing, because I don't think anybody thought that, you know, Taric was getting held back by his low attack breakpoint. But Funsmith is something, this is probably the one that I think is going to be the most disappointing for the largest amount of people. There are 2 mana 1/3s that are not seeing play. This is a 4 mana 1/3. Does not even garnish any immediate value like something like Stony Silencer would. It doesn't offer up any kind of protection for itself, and you just cannot be paying 4 mana for something like this. I don't even think as a 4 mana 2/3 this would have made too much of a difference. If you're going to be going for something like this, yeah, Dreadway feels good when it comes down, but it also searches up a Gangplank. It also has an insane amount of health and offers up itself as an 8 damage unit because of its own ability. Funsmith doesn't do that. She only affects skills and spells, and that is just not enough. This is not what Piltover and Zon needs. I know that we all talked a lot about how we wanted to see PNZ get a lot of buffs coming out of this patch. This ain't it. I'm also optimistic, cautiously optimistic about Blackspear's ability to be put back in Shadow Isle decks. Ever since Rasa got nerfed and then Blackspear got nerfed shortly after, the kill my own units to get really good removal plan just really hasn't been there. I do think that this being able to kill Misfortune through a Ranger's Resolve is good. It doesn't kill her through Sharpsight though, and that's sort of the two-front fold that, Scouts is sort of attacking you on right now. It has these really cheap spells that offer up protection in different ways. You can't Avalanche and Withering Wail through the Ranger's Resolve, and the Sharpsight just offers up, protection against these big burst damage spells like Blackspear. And it is a big help for Callista and Endure Spider specifically, but I think that's the only deck she's really seeing play in right now, and this isn't the kind of champion spell that gets enough of a buff to impact Callista's play rate at all. It'll feel better when you actually do have to use a Callista's Blackspear, but I don't think Blackspear itself is going to see any more play out of this. Maybe if we get some reverts on some Rasa nerfs, get him back down to 7 mana, because 7 is such an awkward turn in Legends of Runeterra. There are almost no good 7 mana cards. Nautilus is really the only one that comes to mind. Eclipse Dragon just got buffed, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I don't think we're going to see Blackspear pick up any playability. But it does depend, because a lot of the late game cards, or a lot of the late game decks in the format did just get hard nerfed. So you are going to be going into a more aggro-centric meta, especially with the Jinx buff. So maybe Blackspear is the answer, but I think that Shadow Isle can still take it to the late game. Spooky Karma is still one of the better Shadow Isle decks in the meta, so we'll have to see, because generally aggro these days isn't really going spell heavy. You don't want those dead cards. You're just playing a lot of draw, and putting something like Blackspear in your deck just seems really odd for the overall what you want to be doing with your deck. And, because we are speaking about this specifically from a tournament standpoint, you are almost certainly going to be playing an open decklist style of tournament. That is a little bit different for the seasonals, but most grassroots tournaments that you're going to run into are open decklist. And gotcha cards like this just do not work when your opponent gets to play around them. Blackspear and Judgment are two cards that would probably be pretty good and just really suffer for that. So maybe in a closed deck list format like Riot, they get a little bit better, but I'm not sure that they're so much better, or at least that Blackspear is so much better that you can put it in your deck. Judgment's a different story. We all kind of saw Riptide coming, which is a shame, because at the moment he's really only seeing play in one deck, and that's Twisted Fate Swain. And I always feel some type of way about it when a card is only seeing play in one deck when it gets nerfed. For example, Trifarian Assessor was only seeing play in Frostbite Midrange when it got nerfed, and I didn't think that Twisted Fate Swain was in such an oppressive spot that we needed to hit Riptide Rex. I thought that this made a little bit more sense a little bit earlier on. I wouldn't even mind Riptide just getting sort of a full overhaul and having his mana reduced, maybe down to 7, while also reducing the number of barrages, maybe like a 7 mana, 5 barrage type thing. But we'll have to see how 6 mana Rex, or 6 power, 6 barrage Rex actually plays out. I'm not optimistic for it, especially because it was already in such a low representation of decks. And I do think that TF Swain will still play it, but we've seen a couple of them, as Twisted Fate Swain gets more aggressively built with a lot more one-drops like Jagged Butcher and Krusty Codger. We have seen Captain Farron start to come up as an additional finisher, people going 3 Leviathan, 2 Rex, 1 Farron. Maybe now we go 1 Rex, 2 Farron. Maybe we cut Rex entirely, because I don't think you can really only run 1 Rex. One of the big powerhouses of this card is just running it out back-to-back. Or, especially with a nerf like this, you definitely want more Rexes, because one isn't necessarily going to clean up the board. You'd like to fire off a second one immediately after the fact. I don't think it gets cut from Twisted Fate Swain, which does still struggle to deal with wider boards. But, this is a quality of life nerf in that regard. You're still going to play the card. It's not going to feel as good when you do, but it does kind of suck. It feels a little bit mistimed to me, but, that just kind of is what it is. Rex is powerful. That's undeniable. People have been asking for this nerf for a while, so I'm not necessarily sad to see it. The Eclipse Dragon buff I did not see coming, and this is a card that I don't think is going to see play in Dragons. Like, I don't think this on top of Shyvana is what pushes Dragons into viability, but this sort of mono Targon, Leona Aurelian Soul, you know, maybe they splash Demacia, sometimes they splash Shadow Isle. Eclipse Dragon was a pretty good top end for them, and it's great when it pops out of Ravoon for some other people. Going up to 7 HP, that's absolutely massive. You're no longer dying to these crappy little 5-drops that are that much weaker than you. You are now just straight beating up a level Trundle as opposed to trading with it previously and just barely trading with it. Your stats were lining up exactly. But Eclipse Dragon has been seeing play in Leona A-Soul because you don't need to play ramp and you can just get this down, and then still Aurelian Soul on 8. It's seeing play with Mind Splitter. And overall, I really like the design of the card, and the fact that it is now more playable is great. When Infinite Mind Splitter started to see a lot of play in a lot of different decks upon release, it wasn't necessarily just for the ability, it's because there are not a lot of units in Legends of Runeterra that have a really high attack and a really high HP to boot. Infinite Mind Splitter saw a lot of play because it was an 8/8, and that is something that is extremely difficult to deal with, especially when it has Fury, like Eclipse Dragon does. This is only going to get a little bit bigger, and honestly, as somebody who likes to play more anti-aggro strategies like myself, I really like the position that this puts things like Leona Aurelian Soul in, which initially had felt a little bit too reliant on the Celestials that you were generating. Now, I do think that this actually does make Leona A-Soul a little bit better than Leona Lux or Lux A-Soul in my mind, and I'm really excited for this change. I'm not necessarily optimistic about it. I think it is obvious that this is a good change, and if you've been following the tournament scene, you know that Eclipse Dragon was already a playable card. The Daybreak strategy, the Daylight, whatever you want to call it, is a very good strategy into the meta, especially now that we have gotten rid of some of the decks that out late game you, like War Mother's Call, like Field of Rush. Spooky Karma still exists, whatever, push it to the side. When you are trying to play this really tempo-oriented strategy and just beat out aggressive decks, we are going into a meta now where I think that is much more viable than it previously was. There are less decks in the format that are going to outvalue you, and I think that just getting to play a value deck like this, especially when you get to ramp into the Aurelian Soul, and just Eclipse Dragon is such a great bridge for the mid game for a deck like that. I really love this change. I'm so excited for the Eclipse Dragon buff. And as a caster, of course, I'm excited about Friend Spectate. Now, I know that I joked a lot about it actually coming out this patch. A lot of us were very excited that it ended up coming out. So thank you, Riot, for pushing this one out a lot sooner than I expected, because honestly, it's not unreasonable that this would have gotten delayed. Spectating is something that a lot of games take a while to get done. I know they had said November, but that sounded optimistic to me. I wouldn't have been surprised if it got pushed back all the way until maybe even January. So this is actually a really nice treat for me. If you do play in tournaments, you're going to have to add me. It just is what it is, baby. I gotta be able to watch your games. So if you're I don't think any tournament players watch my videos, or like high level tournament, you know, like the pro players as people call them. I say that people, like I'm not one of the people that calls them that. Then yeah, you have to add me now. It's gonna be great. My friends list is gonna look stacked, and I gotta bug them all for their secrets. It's gonna be great. And that is the end of the video, everybody. Thank you so much for watching my patch rundown of patch 1.14 for tournament specifications. My name is Boulevard. Follow me on Twitter from the BLVD. Get all the updates on when and where I'm casting. I tweet a bunch of funny shit. You're really missing out if you're not following me. And yeah, as always, good luck in your tournaments.